guys, these birds have been requested by a lot of you on Patreon and then on Instagram. So I was very excited that actually this painting was one of the top 5 in our preview post, so I could edit it into a real-time video with the voiceover. This is the thing about painting white, that you always want to recreate some of those colors which are reflected from the sun or from the water, from anything, from the sand. So whenever you have a bird that's white, obviously there is no true white in that nature, so we need to recreate that white on a paper. And of course, because we're dealing with watercolors and we're working with a watercolor paper, we want to preserve some of that paper white to take advantage of it and treat it as our medium. So we are using paper white as our medium as well. There's a lot of white involved in this painting, but what captured my eyes the most, looking at the reference photo, were actually the shadows. The shadows and different colors of the sand, and also how the light was hitting the sand and the beach, and then you have those footprints, the bird's footprints. But I chose to focus on the main 2 birds, the front ones, and the third bird in the back out of focus. So I knew from the start to give that effect of out of focus, so the bird is blurry. I would be painting that bird wet on wet. While my background is still wet, I would be adding the colors. But the trick is to have not that much water mixed in with your paint. And the reason is because when you start painting that bird and you have too much water mixed in with your paint, then you are not going to be able to achieve the shape of that bird. The paint will just start spreading because we're dealing with water. So you want to really focus on how much water is mixed in with that paint and when you grab it on your brush. So it would be important to dip that brush in water, wipe it on a towel, and then go for the paint, because then you don't bring that much water with you with that brush from the water jar. So then you mix a little bit of that paint with the water that's a little bit on your brush. There's a little bit of water. So this way the paint is not that diluted. And when you go for that paper and the paper is wet and you're trying to paint these legs or the beak, you know that paint is not going to spread as much because you don't have that much water. Remember, the background is already wet, so we already have that water on the paper. So when we're trying to define something and to have more defined lines, we can't have too much water in our brush with that paint. So once that was established, my background, I was able to move forward to the foreground, which is my birds. So thinking about the colors that I wanted to use for the sand, I usually go with yellow ochre, quin red, sometimes Van Dyke brown, but I also add gold, shimmery look, especially when it comes down to sand. Whenever we walk on the beach, and it's sunny out there, you'll see there's a sparkle on the sand, especially when there's water involved. So that's the thing, I always like to add gold, and gold is totally optional. It is a more expensive pigment, and the one I use is by Holbein. Nothing that you have to have, it's just something that I like to add on the side. What's more important is to have that yellow ochre, or you can also use raw sienna, and then add a tiny bit of quinacridone red. What quinacridone red does is just it warms up that sand. So this is just my thing, and so it's totally optional as well. I just recommend it because I feel like it really gives that more of a resemblance to that real sand, the look of the sand. Although I can't say that because we have different colors of sand. Obviously we have white beaches, then we have gray beaches, sometimes there's some brown and so pink beaches. So we have all these different colors, but the one that I'm the closest to, I guess, is yellow sand, and it has some warm tone to it. So it's totally, of course, optional, and you don't have to add quin red. It's just my thing. I love to add that color to my sand. And another color I would be mixing in here is cobalt blue. I needed to add that blue to recreate those colors that I see in the reference photo. So we are actually dealing with primary colors here. So primary colors are yellow, red, and blue. And I was literally using those 3 colors for most of my painting. Just those 3 colors, but different shades. There's different reds, obviously, and different blues and yellows. But I was using primary colors to paint this, to recreate these birds from the reference photo. So the thing I was also focusing on the most is the light. Where is that light? And another thing I like to mention too is I don't want my background to be too busy, because that will take away from my foreground. So whenever I looked at that reference photo, basically, I had to choose in my mind, what am I going to focus on? And how big my watercolor paper will be too. Because to have that ability to paint the detail, and there's not that much detail, but to be able to add all these colors and layers, I needed a larger sheet of a watercolor paper. More room to work, so I can have that ability to really focus on the legs and the shape of the bird and stuff like that. And also easier to put it all together. When you look at the reference photo, it's kind of busy there because there's those birds, and it looks great as a photograph. This photograph is ready to be framed, basically. I thought in my mind, if I painted it exactly like in this photograph, I felt like it would have become too busy and I would have lost that look. So I had to, in my mind, focus on something specific, and the rest of it is going to be like blurred out. It's not going to be as important, so I'm going to paint it wet on wet. But the foreground, my 2 main birds, are going to be painted like with the detail, and I'm gonna make them bigger. And the same thing with shadows, because shadows here and the reflection of those legs on the sand, because the sand is wet there, it's like the main thing almost in this painting. This is what catches your attention, like, wow, those shadows. And the shadows are really easy to do, actually, in this painting. Everything else is a little more complicated because of the colors and capturing that light, and then not losing those colors while we are dealing like with that light, because we need to preserve a lot of that light, but we also want to have those colors. And so my mind was like, the foreground right on the bottom needs to have more color, and then further I go away from that bottom, it's gonna have less color, but I still needed some lines, some strokes, just to show that this is water. Another thing that was important in my mind when I was painting this was those footprints. So I knew I needed to capture those as well, because that's something that adds on to this painting as well. It was very important. So it was the foreground, the light and that sand, and then the shadows and all these shadows and the reflections. So those were my things to focus on. And then once I was painting the birds, it was important to preserve a lot of the white on top of those birds. So some of those feathers on top, they had to stay white. The sand would hit the birds from the bottom of their body. So I would want that part to be more yellowish, reddish. And then the top of the bird, more like wherever the neck is and so on, that's where I wanted to add the blues. So it really takes a lot of studying and looking at your reference photo and trying to really think like, what is the most important thing for you that you want to focus on, and so you don't lose that, to create that balance, so you don't overdo it. Because if I did that background the way I did the foreground, I don't think it would be as, I'd say, interesting in a way. So those are my thoughts behind this, like how I focused on recreating something like this on my watercolor paper. The idea is really to paint white in watercolor, and to me it's one of my favorite things because I really love to paint white in watercolors. And when I say white, it means recreating some of those colors in nature. What makes the white? What makes the color white? And for the brushes, here's the list of my brushes that I used in this painting. Please do not worry about not having the same colors or not painting with Holbein watercolors like I do. Pigments, colors, those are really personal preference, because some people prefer the paints to spread faster in a way, or not as concentrated as Holbein paints, basically. So that's totally fine. And then there's also Daniel Smith paints, which are granulated. And I think if you do have Daniel Smith watercolors, you might want to use that for the sand, because then you will get that granulation right away, which will really give that nice look to the sand as well. It's totally optional if you do paint with Daniel Smith. The paper, watercolor paper I use is Arches, is by Arches. I used a big block, which is 16 by 20, cold pressed, 140 pounds. So I basically just painted on the front side. So with pads, Arches pads, I usually paint on the other side, the wrong side, because the sheets are very different comparing to the pads. And with sheets, when we buy the 22 by 30 sheets, we know right away that this is the correct side because that's where the logo is. With pads, it's very confusing because the front side of those pads, Arches pads, cold press, 140 pounds, does not resemble what we see on sheets, the front side. So that's why I started painting on the wrong side. With blocks, it depends. For the most part, I don't have the problem, but with blocks, it's a little more difficult because they are glued on four sides. So that the purpose is to paint on that front side. I usually just paint water on those big blocks. So what's the first thing I do? I like to use a washi tape. Washi tape is totally optional, so don't worry about it. I just like to add a white frame to my paintings. First thing I did was I used a masking fluid. So this is an art masking fluid for watercolors by Winsor & Newton. I pour it over onto a lid basically, just so I have it like on the side, not in the bottle. And this is my angular quarter brush. This is a very old brush I've had for a long time. And I just splatter paint. This brush is very stiff, and because I've had it so many years, it got kind of damaged. And because it's small and it still has like this tiny little hair, what I do is I kind of rub it off my finger, and I don't put much of that masking fluid on that brush, so I can control the size of it. So I can control how big that spatter is. I go on the bottom mostly where the sand, like you can see that sand. I'll be going a little bit more whatever the birds are and so on. But you really want to maybe practice on the side. Actually, it could be a good idea to practice the splatter on the side. What you want to do is grab a stiffer brush. It doesn't have to be angular brush, but it could be a flat brush. It could be like a mop brush. You want a smaller brush and you really want it to be stiffer. And you could actually also use a toothbrush. So you want to dilute some of the watercolor pigment, let's just say yellow ochre, and dilute that with water. The consistency of that paint diluted with water would be probably like I'd say not heavy cream, half and half. So whatever you put in your coffee, a creamer, that would be kind of like the liquid. So you want to grab a little bit of that and then start splattering a little bit on your watercolor paper, a spare sheet of a watercolor paper, and see how you can feel it out. Like, so the spatters are small, so they're not big. So the more water you're going to have diluted with that splatter, then the bigger that splatter is going to be. And here's the rubber pan, basically rubber pan that I also use for masking fluid. I got this one from Amazon. This was bought on Amazon, and it's just a rubber pan for masking fluid. However, I put it in the search. This is what I found, and it's really helpful because right now I'm just still recreating some of those sand granules, I guess spots on the sand that will keep to have it lighter for later. Because the masking fluid has to dry before we can start painting the background. So right now I'm still just recreating some of these, whenever I see the light spots, like dots, spots, that's basically where I'm trying to cover up with a little bit of masking fluid. And this pan like has both sides to it, so you can use either side. I like to use the rubber side because the other side is actually metal, but it's okay, like whatever you feel like it's more comfortable. I'm also covering some parts of those legs because it's like I want some light to hit those legs as well. There's a lot of light involved in this painting. This painting is almost like white, so that's why like whatever I do, and I'm gonna try to use lightest colors, pale washes, I still need some of that paper white. So I'm using watercolor paper as my medium as well. So I have that white immediately saved for later so I don't lose it. So I'm still looking for the white spots, and there's some areas on the bird. So that's the thing. I'm just trying to add some more, and this is where I'm actually using the metal part, but I prefer much more the rubber part of this pen. So I want to cover a little bit of those feathers, just a little bit, and mostly on the top. If you look at that bird to the right in the reference photo, it has a lot of light on its back, and that's exactly what I'm trying to go for. Like, I know I'm going to use color there. It's gonna be the cobalt turquoise light. There's gonna be on the bottom some of the yellow ochre, some of the quin red. The top part is gonna be mostly white, and then the middle section is going to be blue. So I want to make sure I don't lose those spots. And then more of that sand, the light on the sand, because I'm gonna be painting that beach, the water actually. So this is all wet. The sand is wet, and there's a lot of sparkle going from the sun. So this is when I am letting it dry. It has to be 100% dry before you wet your paper. So don't even bother to do anything until it's 100% dry, because you're gonna pick up otherwise that masking fluid, and it's just gonna become a mess. So I'm wetting. And the way I'm wetting, so this is a larger brush. It's a flat brush, flat stroke, however it's called. It is a flat brush. It's 1.5. And I am not worrying too much about like going over the bird, because I don't want the hard edges around the legs and so on. I would have to go really carefully not to wet it. I'm just doing my best not to go over the legs. But the thing is that the background, the sand, is going to be so light in colors anyways, and the legs are so like pigmented. Basically, there's so much color that it doesn't matter even if I go over when I'm painting the background. So that's why I'm not really worried. And here I'm just going for it. That's the thing. I was just talking about it, but just to give you the idea of like, it really doesn't matter, because the legs are so dark and the background is so light that I can totally just even wet those legs. What's important is not to go over the birds, the feathers. That's the important part. You want to go a little bit, because you want some of that background to go on the body of the birds, but specifically not from the top. Because from the top, when we're looking again at the reference photo, this is where the bird has so much, there's so much light. We need to use that paper white for their backs, for those birds' backs. So right now, first thing I'm gonna do is I am going to paint the sand, the bottom part. And I'm mixing my colors, which is the quin red. There's a little bit, actually, I'm adding now Van Dyke brown, so quin red, yellow ochre, Van Dyke brown, and this is a 3/4 flat brush, Black Velvet Series by Silver Brush. I'm starting from the bottom, and I'm looking at it like, how does it spread? You want to have enough water there when you are wetting the background, because if it starts drying, it's very easy to actually create blooms, or you can end up with hard edges. You want that sand to be soft. So I am creating my purple color. So this is the purple I need for that water to look like it's wet in a way. So this is the purple I created. I'm not placing this color on top of the first layer, the first color that I put in there, which was the yellow ochre with the Van Dyke brown and quin red. I needed to be like touching each other, but not going over. I'm not trying to mix these colors on the paper. I still want that separation of colors, but I want them to blend together from the sides in a way, because that's what's going to give that impression that the water, the beach, the sand is wet. So that's my blue, and there's a little more of that mix of the color that I created. There's some of the Van Dyke brown, and I'm slowly like moving my way towards the top. And the reality is that I'm not fast enough, so that some parts of the paper will dry, and I'm okay with that. I already know that. I'm dealing with a large sheet of a watercolor paper, so part of that paper will dry before I reach some of the areas. It's okay, and I'm gonna be wetting it as I go more. But right now, I just want the bottom part to have that the color. So I'm focusing in sections in a way. So I'm going next to those legs, like I'm not trying purposely to go over the legs because I do want them to still have the color, which will be like the yellowish first, and then I'll add the darker tones. But it's okay if some goes over, because that's the thing, the legs are still dark. And there's a little more of the, I'm darkening up the bottom part of the sand. So the bottom part of that sand will have way more color compared to like moving more up and higher, because I want that contrast, but I can't do too much of it because it's still like a very light colored painting, and reference photo too when we look at the reference photo. So I'm slowly adding the colors, and right now that area, that whatever it's from that 1/3 down of that paper is still wet, so I can keep adding colors and more of that as long as that area of the paper is still wet. If it's not wet, I'm going to create blooms. So that's why I have to be very careful and I have to watch it. So this is the thing. So the bottom part here is not as dry yet. So I was able to start adding the water. So I'm keeping an eye on it, and I need this to be wet so I can continue adding the colors for the sand. And I'm using that flat brush, which is 1.5 Heritage Series by Princeton. And I do not want to go over my birds. I need to preserve that white, especially on top of their backs. The back needs to be white. It needs to be white, so I cannot go over. I just need to be really careful here because I really want to use that paper white as my medium so that back is white. And then I'll continue wetting the paper because I might as well just start painting the rest of the background, because I already got my first strokes on the bottom part. So now I need to visually like see it where I'm going with all of it, and that's why I keep moving forward. Here I have to be really careful now because that blue is drying. So very easy to create that bloom, and I don't want that bloom. So now back to my 3/4 brush. This is a Black Velvet series, and there is some of the Van Dyke brown and indigo. So I'm creating like a brownish grayish color. I also added some of the yellow ochre in there. So I need to fill it out, like how much do I have of all this? And there is a mix, a little bit of burnt sienna and some of the Quin red, basically all these colors. And I can't have too much on my brush. That's why I also kept trying it on the next well, on a third from the right well. That was my extra well where I tried to see the real color that I just created. And this is for the water. I'm just creating some of those waves coming towards the beach. So it's my grayish color. I basically created a gray color to resemble what I see in the photograph. And I can't go everywhere. That's the thing. Like, it's so easy to just go for it and like, oh, I want to just keep painting because I have all this paint on my brush now. It's might as well. But the thing is, you don't want to, because then it's very easy to overdo it. We know that this layer where I just placed those waves, it is going to dry pale. So that's the thing. It's not going to be as vibrant as what we see right now. So I'm taking advantage right now of the fact that this paper, the bottom part is still wet. It's still wet. It is drying, but it's still wet. So whatever I'm painting right now with that smaller brush, it is going to be still wet on wet. So the easiest way to see if I'm painting wet on wet or wet on dry is just watch how the paper spreads. If it stays like the lines, the strokes are very defined, that means it's wet on dry. And if the paint somewhat moves and disperses like in the background, then it's wet on wet. So right now that area started to dry. So that's the thing. I have like a hot day there, and it's just the heat is coming and my paper is drying fast. So I am trying to work fast, but at the same time, I'm taking my time because I know I can wet some of these areas still without disturbing too much of the other sides of the whatever I painted already, because there's a lot of white. So a lot of the parts of my paper are still not painted. So whatever it's not painted, I can still add the water and continue just adding paint. But yes, it's a little complicated when your paper starts to dry. So you have to make a plan. Like, are you working in sections, or are you going to just wet the whole thing? And you really need to be fast to add all the colors you want to add. But that's the thing. I'm like thinking also like, oh, where do I want more paint? Where do I need to add more gray color? Whatever I see that wave and stuff like that. Definitely that the top half of the paper needs to be very pale, and that's what I'm going for. I want the top part, the top part, the half of that top part needs to be more pale, more diluted. All the paint will be more diluted with water, and I want that part to be out of focus because I am not focusing on that bird, the third bird, which is on top. My main focus is on the first two birds on the front. So I'm still working with it, and that area has dried, but I still need to paint the bird. So I'm still gonna paint that bird wet on wet. So what just happened was the paint wasn't 100% dry. I knew that, and I knew what's gonna happen is that whatever I go over those lines, the water lines, they're gonna be disturbed a little bit. They'll spread a little bit, but that's okay because if we look at the beach, the reference photo, those lines are not that defined. They're defined, but they're blurry-ish. So it was okay to do that. But sometimes it's not, because then you're gonna just pick up the whole paint and everything will just become muddy. So now here's the bird. I'm starting from the bottom. So I'm picking up some of those colors, which is the burnt sienna, some of the yellow ochre, and I'm trying to define the shape of that bird. I still see a little bit of my sketch, not much, but there's a little bit of it. So I know how that if I have too much water now in my brush, I won't be able to define those lines. So right now it's like almost like I'm sketching with my brush to recreate that bird. And if I had too much water in that brush, I would lose that shape of it. Like I would not see those legs. So that's the thing. You want to have way less water mixed in with your paint now. I'm not even going for my jar really for the water that much. I wiped it well on a towel, and that's the thing. Like I need to make sure that that paint doesn't have much water. So those lines stay. So I keep that shape of that bird because I am painting that bird out of focus, and I do not want much water. It's very easy to lose control here because we're dealing with a wet paper already. We're painting wet on wet. But the way to control it is by having like that amount of water mixed in with your paint, like how much water is with your paint already. So that's the thing, like the less you have, the more control you're gonna have. So I have to lift up a little bit in a way. It's not like lifting up. I'm almost like pushing the paint just to make the legs more smooth. So now the important thing is to start working on areas that I still want to have that soft look before my paper completely dries. For example, these shadows under the legs, under the feet. So the paper is still wet, and it's very easy here actually to create blooms now because that portion of the paper is not 100% dry, but it's still a little bit wet. So to be able to do what I just do, you want to have a minimum amount of water mixed in with your paint, but you're also going for the pale wash, right? So that's the thing, like how much water. You want that paint to be more like a half and half and heavy, between half and half and heavy cream. And another thing is, you want to have that paint on the tip of your brush, not loaded. Like, you don't want your brush to be loaded with that paint. You want to have it on the tip of the brush because you can control it more, and this way you grab less. So now I'm recreating some of those footprints, and definitely less water here mixed in with my paint, because that's the only way I can make sure these lines are stay defined. So it will dry, it will still disperse now because the paper is wet, but it's drying. And most of that moisture is gone, so it's still wet because you can tell like the lines are just not that defined. But that's why I'm careful here. I'm using the tip of my brush, and if I feel like I had too much water, then I would just walk away from it, because I would dip this brush in water, wipe it on a towel, and then go for it again for the paint, because it's very easy to create that bloom. So I'm adding more color, which is the indigo, just to recreate some of these shadows already, the reflections that we see in that sand, because the sand is wet, and that's why we're seeing all these nice reflections, because there's shadows also to the right, but those are just reflections on the water in a way. But that's because that sand is wet, and we have to paint. It's like painting almost two shadows, but it's not. But that's what I'm trying to like think sometimes, like, okay, I'm gonna paint this one and then this one, but these reflections are wet on wet, while the shadows are going to be wet on dry. And we're gonna do that at the end when the background is 100% dry, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to achieve that soft, not soft, but it's like real shadow, like a shadow. If it's wet on wet, it's just, I mean, it works sometimes, but not in this case, because the shadow is really defined. So right now I'm going for Van Dyke Brown, Indigo, and I'm still working on that sand. I'm taking advantage that the sand has not dried 100% yet, so it's not like all the way dry yet, and so I can play with it, and I can add some drop, like a spatter here and there. Not really spatter, I'm just going slowly, and there's a drop here of paint, there's like one dot here and there, because that's what we see in the real sand. Like when we walk on the beach, there's always something, and there's a lot of shadows of sand created by sand, because the sand is not even. You have all these rocks, and you have some shells sometimes, just all that stuff. The sand is not just plain one color. You always find something there, and that's in the sand. This is a long round 8 Aqua Elite series by Princeton, and I like this brush because it has a long thin end. Another brush that I like a lot is the Black Velvet series by Silver Brush, and that's a much softer brush, but it has a little more pointy end, so it just depends what you like to work with. If you like softer brushes, then that one would be probably better. If you like a little more like stiffer brushes and also more natural brushes, then it would be this one, Aqua Elite series by Princeton, because this is a synthetic brush, while Black Velvet brush is half synthetic and half blue squirrel, I believe. And so I'm painting the feathers, and I'm using those warmer colors, warmer tones, more on the bottom part of that bird. So we're creating some of these feathers, but overall, like if you look at my painting, there's not that much detail. I talk about detail, but of course it's more detailed than you compare it to the bird in the back, but it really isn't. And here actually it's important that I say that, so I have the yellowish or orange, like a peachy color almost, and then I'm bringing in all this cobalt turquoise light, and it's very easy to like, basically when you mix blue and yellow you get green, right? But it's important to be careful here how you mix it. So I'm placing these colors next to each other, painting it wet on dry, so they're blending on sides in a way, and the pigments are really they spread, but they're very controllable, and they're good quality. And that's the thing, when you paint with good quality watercolors, your paints won't become as muddy and you won't have that problem that suddenly you get that green color. Of course, I can easily achieve that green color when I mix on the side yellow with the blue. Of course, that will automatically become green color. But the way you mix the colors, these colors separately on the paper matters. So that's why I'm going on sides, so the paint like doesn't go over too much, so I don't create that green, basically. So I'm pulling a little bit of that paint, and as I am painting those feathers, and there's a little bit of indigo as well, so my darker blue color, and watching my reference photo and looking at the bird to the left. So that's my focus. Like, where do I have all that hair, or where can I use the tip of my brush actually to paint some of that hair too? And the warmer side of it will be on the bottom, which is another reason like I like this painting or reference photo so much, is because it has a warm tone to it, and then you have the coolness to it. So the cold colors are like blue colors, and then the warm colors would be yellow and then red. So think sun, for example, sun or heart would be red, and then sun would be yellow. So those would be the warm colors. And then water, whenever you see watercolors, colors of water, of ocean, those are the cold colors. So you have that coolness. But I like this one, and despite that, the fact that this is ocean, so automatically, okay, it will be cold painting. Not really, because we have all this warmth coming from the sand, and I'm adding extra more actually in this painting, because I'm also using later on isolidolinon yellow deep. So if you don't have that color, actually, you could use cadmium yellow light, for example. That would be okay too. So with the tip of my brush, I grab that paint and I'm trying to define parts of that face and other parts of the body. I need to create contrast. So without that contrast, the bird will not look like 3D in a way, and it will not have that depth. And I need to create that. So how do I do that? I focus on whatever the parts of the body are darker, and where is the most shadow come from, like where is the shadow on the bird. And also, the most important thing is actually to keep that white on top, so you don't lose the watercolor paper white on top of that bird, all these white feathers on top. So that's important. But I'm slowly here creating that shape. I'm giving the bird that the shape, the fullness. And this is a Prado series brush, Rigor Zero. This is also a script liner, however the companies call it. It's all the same thing, basically a long, thin brush. And I like this brush a lot because it's like not soft, but it's thin, like all the way it's thin, and it's easy to control, it's springy, and it's not too soft. It's actually like between stiffness, being stiff and soft. It's just enough so I can create nice lines. So this is just pulling the paint a little bit and trying to recreate some of those feathers. So I have that hair, and here I'm trying to still shape it in a way, and to make sure this bird looks full. So I want to give him some life, so it's not flat, basically. And more of those warmer colors. And then I'm getting rid of that brush. I'm gonna grab now my long round 8 Aqua Elite series by Princeton, and of course dipping first my brush in water and then going for a little bit of gold. Actually, I'm grabbing some of the gold, some of the Quin Red, and going for the bird number 2 and starting again from the bottom. So there's my Quin Red, some of the gold, there's some yellow ochre, mixing all these colors, the warmer colors going on the bottom of the bird, on the belly. So I'm looking at my reference photo again and studying it at the same time. I'm still studying it. Even I took my time before I started painting this bird. I am still like constantly looking and thinking about it. There's so many things I didn't see, like in my first few minutes when I was just staring at the reference photo. There's other things I didn't like notice at first, and now it's like, okay, I'm watching it and I'm painting, and I'm focusing on whatever I need to bring those warmer colors, warmer tones. This is where I'm going for it, and I'm leaving some area like, okay, this is where I'm going to add some of that cobalt turquoise light mixed with cobalt blue. So I'm adding these colors, trying not to add it like really on top, more like on sides, like whatever I don't have that yellow, warm yellow color that I created, or orangey color. So I'm going more on sides, and it's okay if some parts mix, but I do want parts of it to have that nice turquoise color. Another thing is, when you do paint with professional grade watercolors, and let's say you paint your first layer and it's more transparent layer, you let that layer 100% dry, and then you add another layer of, let's say, different color. And it also depends from the paper you work with, so I'll get to that in a second. You'll be able to see that second layer color if it's a different color on top of the first layer if you let first layer dry. Now, I mentioned about papers because some papers lift up too easily. So that's the thing. Like if you paint on a paper like Strathmore Imperial Series 500 series, actually Imperial 500 is the same thing, but if you paint on that paper, it's super easy to lift up your previous layer, previous colors, so you're not able to really create something like that. It will be harder. I call that paper a one layer paper because it's super easy to lift it up, so I prefer not to unless I'm specifically painting something with a one layer. This is back to my rigger brush size 0 Prado series by Escoda, and I'm using that brush again to paint some of that hair. I needed here a little lift up just to open it up a little more. The same thing with those blue feathers. It's lifting it up, but at the same time, I'm wetting it because I want the soft effect. I want these colors to run into each other, but I want them to look soft. I don't want the hard edges. And now I'm just pulling that paint. This is my yellows. This is the yellow ochre, quin red, some of the gold. Don't worry about the gold when I say it. It's okay if you just use the yellow ochre. And then I'm just painting some of that hair. So I'm pulling in a way that from that side and just moving that paint towards the bottom. So it's like I'm spreading that paint and painting the feathers. So I'm glad that the way the lights is set on my table now, because you can actually see the parts that are wet of that bird. So you can see exactly like whatever I'm going to add some paint, you will know like, okay, she's adding paint and this is blue, but it's not becoming green. It just depends what moments you're adding that color, and how you add that color and where you add that color. So we're not mixing these colors on the side like in a well to create green from the blue and yellow. We're doing this on the paper, not by mixing these colors together, but adding them more next to each other. And sometimes, yes, there's a little bit on top, but we're not purposely mixing these colors. And whenever you paint with watercolors, so you painted something with one color, and as soon as you add some water, and of course when your area is still wet, then it pushes your paint away when you add the water. So that's the thing. But I can talk about it in a second. Now it's more important the fact that I am wetting the bottom part of that sand. So I'm wetting using 1.5 inch brush, and this is the Heritage Series flat brush, and I'm still going over the legs. I don't bother to like go around. I'm okay with if there's any color that's gonna go over. I'm going to focus on adding colors from more on the bottom part of the paper, from the bottom. So this is my 3/4 flat brush Black Velvet Series by Silver Brush, and just starting from the bottom, there is some of the burnt sienna, yellow ochre, there's some of the quin red, Van Dyke brown, all the colors that I've used before, more on the reddish side. So for sure the dominant color would be the burnt sienna. and I'd say yellow ochre with the quin red too. And then there's some of that gray color, so some of the indigo and cobalt blue mixed in with those colors as well. And this is where my water and the painting will resemble more of that wet look. So whenever I add that blue, that will give you the impression that that area of that sand is still wet. So that's why it's important how we add this blue color. And another thing was important to wet it first. So re-wet the paper, and we already have that first layer, which is the yellowish layer. But now, almost like next to it, but on top of it now, I'm adding that blue. So I was just talking about like that whenever you wait till the first layer dries and then you add the second layer of paint on top of that dry layer, and the first layer doesn't get activated as much because depending on the paper you're using, you will see that color on top of, so that's why we're seeing blue on top of the yellow, because our yellow has dried before, and this is Arches paper, so we don't activate as much of that paint, the previous layer. That's why it's such a nice paper that you can just do so much with it. If I was painting this right now, I was doing this on the Strathmore 500 series watercolor paper cold pressed, then I would automatically lift up everything I already did earlier, the yellow, all the yellow tones mixed in with the quin red. I would have activated all that, and it would just become like a mess basically on my paper when it comes down to this style of painting, because of course you can use different papers for different styles, and it just depends on what you're painting. So the bottom part of this, I want it to be more vibrant in a way, so have more color. So this is my round 2, and this is the Heritage series by Princeton, and this part of the paper is 100% dry, so I am wetting first the legs, and now I'm going first for more of a yellow color, which is Isoly Yellow Deep. If you do not have this color, you can just use, for example, Cadmium Yellow Light, and I added some of that yellow ochre also to the Isoly Yellow Deep, and I am adding the first layer on those legs. So obviously when we look at this bird's legs, we kind of see like brownish, kind of dark color. We don't really see that much yellow. But the important thing is to work in layers and see lighter colors first, because with watercolors we go from light to dark. So we go from light to dark. That's why I saw this color in the reference photo, and I'm like, this is the yellow that I see in the first layer underneath that all that brown color on the legs. I need to start with that because that will give me that extra glow around the legs, that light. So I need to start with the yellow color first, all that light color. So that's what I'm doing. And then there's some of the quin red, there's burnt sienna, and now I'm playing more with it, and of course there's some of my yellow at the same time, but I'm adding a little more color to around the feet. So the feet in the photograph, they're more yellow actually. So when we look at the reference photo, they're definitely more yellow. And also see how like I use the tip of my brush to paint this now. I don't want the paint to be like all over my brush in all that hair. I just want to use the tip of my brush, and I don't use that much paint. It's just that tip of the brush, and there's not that much water, so I have more control. So I am painting the feet and focusing on them more with those yellow colors because they are yellow, and the top part of those legs is not going to be that yellow really once we add all these colors. So there's some of that Van Dyke brown, there's some of the quin red, and this is the moment when I am adding another color on top of my yellow. So the legs are still wet, the layer is still wet, and I'm just adding on top of that another color, and that's what will give me that glowy look in a way around the feet, so we can still see some of that yellow light or yellow in those feet. So they're dark, but we can see that there's some of the yellow, and that will make it look more natural. So there's more of the Van Dyke brown, and just adding, going slowly. And be careful, if your paper is still wet on the right side, you might want to wait until the entire paper is 100% dry. I started painting because for me it was dry enough, and I don't have to worry about like picking up some of the paint from the right side, and you don't want to disturb the colors once you already have all these colors on the sand, because we already achieved that nice look of the wetness of the sand. So these are darker tones, and they're going over those browns and yellows. So we're going over that. And the thing is, you don't want to go like everywhere or just have like a larger brush and just go with one stroke and color the entire leg at once. You want to go in stages, and you don't want to really put that paint everywhere. It's like you're watching it and adding that paint in some areas, but also like, there is yellow, so try to pick a side of those legs, just one side, and focus on adding that darker tones on that one side. Everything else would kind of spread to the left. For example, if you decide, well, it should be the right side of this leg should be darker because it would be under like more of a shadow in a way. So the left side would be lighter. So you would want to add more color, technically, the darker tones on the right side of that leg. So at the same time, I was painting the leg, the foot, and part of it will also have like a little darker color, and then there's a lighter color. So it depends how that light is hitting it and where the light is hitting. So there's my second leg, and I'm going more on the right side in a way, and adding first the brown colors. So I'm adding all those browns, and I'm going carefully because, like I said, you don't want to just go all at once and just add all this dark color on top of the yellow, because you lose that impression like that there's that yellow, the glow in there. So there's some of the indigo as well. There's my Van Dyke brown and a little more of the indigo color, and then going mostly from the right side it's darker, and then on the left side it's a little lighter. And then when you paint the foot, the toes, I guess, then the claws, then you want the darker on the bottom, more on the bottom part of the foot, those underneath those claws, because that's where you would have those shadows. That's where the foot is touching the sand. So everything else would be a little lighter on top, because that's where the light would be hitting from the top. So here's the darker on the bottom, underneath those claws and that foot, and you want to go with the darker tones. You want to use the tip of your brush, and you want to have paint on the tip of your brush. That's the best way to control the paint and what you're doing. And also working with a smaller brush. You want to work with a smaller brush. You can work with a 0, you can work with size 1, 2, but I wouldn't recommend to go any larger unless your painting, the entire painting, was way bigger than mine. This is a 16 by 20 size. So this is a large block by arches. And then I'm spreading a little bit top parts of those legs just so it blends underneath those feathers, because we wouldn't have that straight line like, okay, that's where the legs cut off, like that's where the cutoff is. No, you want that softer blending in there because the legs are hidden under those feathers. And then I'm trying to still define like more, so basically contrast. I want some more of that contrast and give the depth to the bird, and to make this bird look rounded, to give him a shape, nice shape. And of course, warmer colors, warmer tones go on the bottom part, so underneath the bird in a way, and all that belly part will be more reddish, more yellowish, more pinkish, and all these colors. And right now I'm still working with the same brush, and you can switch now if you want to round 8 if you have been painting with that brush, or you can just use a little larger brush so it'll be easier for you. Sometimes I don't switch brushes like right away, just because it's like kind of like I'm already comfortable, I'm painting with this brush, I don't need to switch the brush yet, I'm fine with it. So sometimes you see me painting with a rigger brush, script liner brush, which is the long thin brush, and I'm painting something that I should be painting with like a smaller brush because it just makes more sense to reach the areas, but I'm comfortable with that brush right now and I have all this paint on it. I just want to paint with that brush, and that sometimes I will paint like an eye with that rigger brush, which it's tricky because it's a long brush and it's a little harder to control, but that's the thing, like it's fun. So sometimes it's challenging too, and of course I like challenges. And there's more of the indigo and Van Dyke brown, and I'm going underneath that body, more of those more lines, and I'm building up that body in a way, like the 3D look. So I want this bird to look full and not to look plain, flat basically. I don't want it to look flat. So I'm just defining the shape of it and adding more color whenever I see the darker tones in the reference photo. I'm adding darker colors, and it's all about studying it and just watching your reference photo. Whenever you see darker colors, and there's easier ways, of course, to paint this bird, and you wouldn't have to worry about like all these feathers and stuff like that. But it would be just like or one layer painting, let's say. You could totally go with just the yellow ochre, some of the quin red, and cobalt turquoise light, and just paint with those colors as a one layer. Just add these colors in darker tone. I guess I would add neutral tint at the same time. But there is different ways to paint it, and you could just give that impression that there's a bird, especially if you're painting this using this reference photo on very small watercolor paper. Let's say like a 8x10, if you're painting on the 8x10, or even like a 7x9, even smaller, then obviously you wouldn't have the room to really paint that detail. You could, but would you want to? That's the thing. So in that case, if I was painting on a very small sheet of a watercolor paper, I would just focus on giving the impression of that bird by colors. I wouldn't worry much about detail or building it up by layers. It would be mostly just one layer painting and just focusing on adding more pigment at first, adding more pigment and more color, and then right away defining the shape, so I don't have to worry much about anything. But I prefer this way because it just gives this bird a nice, like a realistic look. It is still a painting, and obviously it looks like a watercolor, but I still like the way like I can build up these layers and add these feathers and all these colors and on top of each other. It looks nice. So here's my beak. I'm gonna first start by adding some of the tones, lighter tones, wetting it in the same way at the same time. So there's some of the quin red, some of the yellow ochre mixed in there. And at first I'm just adding a little bit of paint and feeling it out because I want that beak eventually to be darker. So there is some of that indigo and Van Dyke brown and a little bit back to my beak, but as a thing, it's a small area now comparing to the rest of the body of that beak. So I have to be careful there because that beak is already wet, and because I added some of the quin red and yellow ochre. So if I add too much, I will lose those colors right away, and I want to be careful there. So it's just, I'm watching it basically and deciding based on that, like how much, what do I want to do? Like, is this dry enough yet? Or this part is not. Obviously it's spreading fast or faster, so I have to be careful. And I can't really define any lines yet, but I can at least add some of that color, the first color, on top of my quin red and yellow ochre. So there's that indigo. So add a little bit of that. I'm not letting it all blend at once, so I keep the colors in a way still visible, like separately. And then there's some of the Isole Italian yellow deep, and painting the eye, because that area of the eye, it is much more yellowish, and I want to make sure I can see that. And so that's why I'm like, I can't work on the beak, but I can work on the other parts, and that's why I keep moving to the left. It's like whatever I can work on while the other parts are drying, that's important, because then it's like I can continue painting I can stay here without walking away and just enjoy my painting, just keep working on it. So this is where I was feeling out like, okay, those legs are still wet. So I do not want to paint the legs on the right bird yet because that part is still wet from painting that sand. So back to my beak, and this is the same brush, smaller brush, and I'm going like from the edges, the top part and the bottom part. I'm not letting the middle part blend yet, that bottom middle part. I'm going very slowly here and I'm thinking about it like, okay, where can I add this paint? Because I don't want to lose my first layer that I just created, like first colors. I still want that somewhat separation so you can see that there's other colors at the same time. So I'm going slowly and feeling it out, like watching it, how it spreads, what happens, how much more I can add without losing the shape of it. And plus, my head is like so far out away from this because this is a 16 by 20 and I don't want my face in the camera and my head in the camera, so you wouldn't be able to see it. So my arm is really stretched out there and it's a little harder sometimes to work on a detail when I can't have my head so close to it. So sometimes it takes me a little longer to, for example, paint this eye because I have to really think about it. I always like to focus on the eyes. Like whenever I paint an animal, bird or a dog, cat, I always try to focus on their eyes the most because I feel like that's what speaks to a person that's looking at their painting the most. It's the eyes, the expression. The eyes tell you so much. So that's why I always put so much focus on it. And if you would like to really learn how to paint eyes in watercolors, more than just this, then I do have a class on Teachable, and it's all about painting eyes in watercolors. And there's two different studies we do there. One eye is cat's eye, and the other one is horse's eye. It's a very detailed class, a few hours long. There's also a challenge, painting challenge at the end after the class is completed. So if you would like to learn more about painting eyes, like more detailed eyes, you can enroll over there. So I'm just kind of finding the colors that I see in the reference photos. So in this case, whenever I paint such small eye, I zoom in on the photograph. I zoom in on my reference photo a lot, and to make sure I see what's inside that eye, all the colors. So that's the thing, like it's important to zoom in, I think, whenever you have like a smaller a bird in this case, and you can't really see it from far. But that's the thing, once you zoom in, it's like, oh, I see some of the yellow, then I see some of those browns and stuff like that. The same thing with the beak. Like it's harder to see the beak unless you zoom in, like to see the colors. Unless you're painting this as a smaller card, like a postcard or something like that, then you can just pick a couple colors for the beak. Let's say indigo and maybe Van Dyke brown would be enough. But if we're trying to recreate something on a larger scale, then it's important to zoom in and study it, what you see first, and then so it looks more natural, more realistic on your watercolor painting. So there's some of my purple. So there's a lot of different colors that go on those feathers. Of course, it's the yellows mixed in with quin red, some of the burnt sienna, and then I also have some of that purple, and that's where I want to mix some of those blues with my quinacridone red. There's a little bit of pink as well. So whatever the sun picks up, I guess, and reflects on the feather. And then also if we have all those colors coming from the sand, that's what we want to show on the feather, because the bird is so white. So it picks up all the colors that the bird is surrounded by. So that's the thing. And this is my still smaller brush. And I'm working on that smaller detail around the beak and defining the lines, the edges. So darker on the edges, and whatever is on the inside will blend anyway, because the way the paint will spread will still end up like meeting in the middle section. And then there's the middle section of the eye, and I have to be very careful here. It's hard to see because this is a large scale paper, and I normally paint more like a 12 by 16. It's like a larger size. I do paint a lot on that. I do paint a lot on 10 by 14. Usually animals are 12 by 16 though. And this is way larger, so the camera is sitting above my paper and it picks up some of that detail, but sometimes it's not easy just to capture all of it. So that's the thing. It's hard for me sometimes to show everything, like especially when something is so small like that beak. But here I am wetting the beak first, and on top of that I'm going to add the colors. So first I'm going for that burnt sienna. There's a tiny bit of quin red, and going by the edges of the beak. So first, using the tip of my brush, I'm first defining the edges, like the outside parts, almost not the outside but the edges of the beak. And whenever I see the yellow or that orangey color, that's what I'm using the tip of my brush with already all that paint that I already have there. And I'm just going for it and I'm adding those colors. And it's kind of like watching, like whatever I have more of that warm color, then I'm going to add it there. And then I can go for the darker tones, which is the Van Dyke brown. And again, from the edges, just going defining the edges, but at the same time those colors meet in a way, and I'm letting them blend. But definitely using the tip of the brush. It's a smaller brush, so smaller brush means you have more control, and you want to have more control when you paint such a small area. And of course that area needs to be dry, so the background can't be wet if we want to paint something so specific, and we don't want that beak, the colors of the beak, to go in the background. We want to really define that beak. So here I go, still defining the lines and painting a little bit on the inside and just adding the darker tones, darker colors to that beak, going slowly, steady. And you want to be comfortable when you do that. You probably want to have your face closer to it too, so you can see better. And that's the thing, like I'm painting a little further away because I don't want my head in the camera, so you wouldn't be able to see it. But I'm trying to let these colors to spread in a way, but they're also under control. So parts are drier and the middle section is wet-ish. So now when I'm adding the darker color, that part will go towards the top part of the beak. So I'm kind of letting it all like spread or blend together. And then there's my eye, and the eye, parts of the eye have to be darker too. And so this is the kind of important part, I guess, because this is the detail. The most detail that goes is actually towards the beak, a little bit towards the eye, and then the legs. So this is my Aqua Elite Series brush, burnt sienna, quinacridone red, and still working on the belly of the bird, adding more color to it. So there's burnt sienna, there's some of the yellow ochre. I'm adding those colors on the bottom because I also want this bird to look fuller, to have more depth to it, to have that 3D look, so it looks full and healthy. So the bird looks healthy. So some more warmer colors on the bottom part, and then all the cooler tones more on the top part, although we have that white on the top, which is a neutral color, but we have the white feathers on top, and that part could be a little warmer at the same time, but definitely warmer on the bottom. And then the blues, the cobalt turquoise light and some of the cobalt blue goes in the middle section of those feathers. There's some of that darker colors. Darker colors go in the middle too, because we have that wing, and underneath that wing we would have the shadow. So we need that darker color underneath it. And then there's some of the quin red mixed in with the cobalt blue. So there's my purple color. I just created a purple color, and I want that color to go towards the tail, more towards the tail, and spreading it forward towards the other parts, but not too much. Everything is really gradually adding. And dip my brush in water. And now I'm just spreading what I have and playing with it. Everything is really pale washes here, not too much paint. That's important, not to have much paint, because you are trying to make this bird look very delicate, soft, like, not soft, but it's lighter colors, and the bird is white. That's why you don't want to use too much paint and generally using too much paint can cause muddiness and easily you can lose control. Sometimes I do grab more paint. It just depends what I paint, that's the thing. And it works, for example, when I paint wet on wet and I'm trying to make a background really vibrant. Like there was a painting I did of a hummingbird and there was a red flower and then the background was like yellowish, greenish. And I did want to add more color from the start. So I wetted the background. I made sure that paper was wet and I went over that paper multiple times with my brush. And it's important to really get deep in the paper when you wet it. It's not about having those pools of water sitting on top of your paper. It's about having that wet water spread evenly, but going over the paper multiple times. It's like you're trying to get really deep inside that paper. But then when you look at it, it's just wet. You don't see any water just sitting around. But anyway, that will allow you to work on your paper longer when it's wetted, when you're trying to do wet on wet. So that's the thing. And then I had all this pigment, and then I needed to add more pigment to create this vibrancy. So that's why I was carrying right away from the start more paint. So the paint was still diluted with water, but there was not that much water because we are already dealing with a wet paper, so there's no need to have much of that water mixed in with our paint, unless we want even more spread out effect, like more out of control. But generally you can actually control wet on wet if you don't have that much water mixed in with your paint. So I'm painting that feathers and adding colors gradually because of course I don't want to have these colors like blue and yellow mix into green. So I'm gradually adding the colors on top of other layers. At this point there's layers underneath and some parts have dried, and I'm just adding more whenever I feel like it needs more depth and more color, more contrast. So I'm trying to add that contrast, for example, to make sure we can see that there's a wing. This is a round 2 brush Heritage series by Princeton, and there's some of the neutral tint, some of that indigo as well, Van Dyke brown, and I'm still working on the beak and using that tip of that small brush to define the lines of that beak. So I have to go slow here because this is a smaller area and that's why I'm working with a smaller brush. If it was a larger brush like the Long Round 8 Aqua Elite series, then that tip of that brush is not like, it's pointy and it's longer, but it's not as smooth. That brush is great for like larger things that I'm painting, and I love that long round pointy part, but it's not as smooth in the way. So like the Black Velvet series brush round 8 is much pointier and smoother. So the end of it resembles more like a smaller brush. So I could probably use that brush for painting the beak still, but in this case it's just easier to grab the round 2 and do it all and paint that beak. So I'll be adding more color later too. For now it's just working around the head area and adding whenever I need more color, I'm just adding that color. And it's all the same colors. I'm not adding anything extra here. There's some more of that darker tone, so to define that eye of the bird a little more, there's some neutral tint, there's some of the Van Dyke brown. And this bird, actually, when you look at the reference photo, the bird on the right side is actually funny looking. So I was trying to capture that look a little bit because he's kind of like awkward looking a little bit. So anyway, now I am going to paint the legs of bird number 2 or 3, and I'm wetting first the leg areas, and we're gonna start with those yellows, so which is Isoly Delenon, Yellow Deep, and some of the Quen Red. So I am wetting the legs first and then adding the color second. So starting from lighter colors, lighter tones, in this case we see that glow coming out from those legs. So the base color would be our yellow. So I'm adding that yellow also towards the feet, the claws, the finger, the toes, and I'm adding that yellow color and spreading it all over, although those parts of the legs are going to be covered in darker colors, darker tones. But the feet are still going to have some of that yellow, which is important to show that yellow, because we can definitely see that yellow in the reference photo, that this bird has yellow feet. So there is some more of the Isoli non yellow deep, some of the yellow ochre, and adding more of that yellow. And I am painting wet on dry, and I'm defining more of these feet. You'll see the shadows for these birds are gonna be like the most fun. I love painting shadows. It's like I don't paint enough of them. I just don't find maybe enough of those reference photos that have shadows. But especially like these shadows on the sand, because we have this nice color of that sand already created, and we can tell like some parts are wet. It's just like it adds so much, that shadow. This is actually what captured my eyes so much. It's like, well, one thing is I always wanted to paint these birds, and I could never actually capture a good photo when I was at the beach of them. They always run away anyway. But I couldn't get a close-up and stuff like that. And finally I saw this reference photo, and I was scrolling for more reference photos for my future paintings for you guys. And I saw this one, and I'm like, oh, this is it. Like, this is exactly what I always wanted to paint. Anyway, this is a Van Dyke Brown and Indigo, and I'm painting, again, finding that side that I want darker of those legs, and I'm not letting like just to go with one big stroke cover up the whole leg. No, I'm doing this gradually. You want to do it gradually, and you want to watch how your paint mixes with that first layer, which is the yellow. So you're watching it, and you're based on that, like you're watching and seeing how the paint spreads, and then add a little bit more. And you do not want to have much water here, because and paint at the same time. You're using a smaller brush, so you will have more control, but you don't want to have that much paint water mixed in with your paint, because otherwise it will spread too fast and you won't have that control that you have now, which is like, okay, I want a little more color, darker tone on the right side of the leg and versus the left side. So that's why you want to do it gradually and not have that much water. You always want to have water because you are dealing with watercolors. So no matter what, you need water in your watercolors. But it's just a matter of how. And also, is it wet on wet that you're painting or wet on dry? And that's the thing. So I like to paint both ways. Maybe my favorite actually would be the wet on wet. But still, like it's all about how much you have on your brush and or mixed in with your paint. And that's how you can control everything better. So there's some of that burnt sienna, and I'm adding a little more and going more around those claws now. So they are yellow, but there's a little bit of that darker tone there. And so I'm using some of the burnt sienna. There's more of that burnt sienna, and first going along those long legs and just playing with it, moving that darker tone by using that burnt sienna, and then there's some of the quin red and yellow ochre and some more color, adding it on top and defining those claws. So the claws are important here too, because it's like you see them and right away, because you're looking at all that reflection of those feet down, and then you see later those shadows, so it's like your eyes are drawn to it at the same time. And you want to give that impression like those birds are like coming not towards you, but they're so close to you, like it's almost like 3D. So it's a realistic painting, but we can tell it's a watercolor painting. So it's fun to paint realistic, but at the same time I really want to still make sure it looks like a painting. This is a short liner 10/0 Heritage Series by Princeton. Now, why did I grab this brush? Well, because I needed something smaller to paint that eye and the beak, because I'm still not 100% satisfied the way it is, because I need more color. I need it to be darker, but not adding the color everywhere. I just need some more contrast around the eye and around the beak, because like when you look at that reference photo, like that bird really has a funny face expression. It's kind of like a little bit awkward the way he's looking, or the body is like a little bit, I guess, angled in a way. So I like this bird a lot, and I wanted to paint him like for sure. Like, okay, I need to make sure I can get that eye. So this is the smaller brush, and that's why I'm using it. And you don't have to have, of course, the same brushes. These are Princeton brushes, Heritage series, mostly that I'm using here, except the long round 8 Aqua Elite series. Heritage series is a newer series to me. They've had this series for a long time, but to me it's pretty new because I used to paint mostly with Velvet Touch series, and then I discovered this series and I prefer this series much more actually. This series is a little softer than Velvet Touch, and I just feel like it's a little better too at the same time, a little better quality, at least to me it feels like it. So I like this series a lot, and doesn't mean that I'm not gonna paint again with the Velvet Touch. I do use Velvet Touch, especially their chisel blender brushes, which are great to lift up the paint, and I do a lot of lifting up. But if I'm going to go between the Round Zero Velvet Touch and then the Heritage series Round Zero, then I'm gonna go for the Heritage series, unless I am painting something that needs a really steady, small, defined line, then I am gonna go for a stiffer brush, and not necessarily I'd go for Velvet Touch. I might as well go for like Barocco series, which is a series by Escoda. So that's the thing, that's even stiffer than Velvet Touch, and Barocco series is actually really good. Those are really good brushes. Generally, Escoda makes great brushes. They're all handmade in their Barcelona warehouse. So it's like really everything is handmade, and you can watch their videos on YouTube actually. And there's one video, and I was watching it because I was very curious how they make their brushes. Of course, with thinking that maybe one day I can make my own brush. But that's the thing, they were talking how they do it, and they said they are like the only company that still makes handmade brushes. And I can't remember how many brushes they make per hour. It's not that many. It was like 300 brushes an hour or something like that. I'm probably wrong here, but I know it was some kind of like amount, that it wasn't as much as obviously it would be like made by a machine. But it was pretty impressive to me. Like, I was impressed that they make these brushes, and they have all these employees there, and everybody has their own purpose there, like what they do. I like these brushes, Barocco series, and another similar series to Barocco they have is Perla, and Perla is really good too. It's stiff. They feel different a little bit. They're stiff the same way in a way. I can't tell which one is stiffer yet. I would have to paint with them a little more and more consistently. Right now I'm just jumping between this and that. Just depends what I'm painting, I guess, because it really depends. When I was painting some of the flowers, I prefer to use Perla series, especially the little ones, the smaller brushes like 2/0. If you're looking for these brushes by Escoda, it is harder to find them for some reason in the US, at least harder for me to find them. Sometimes they have them on Amazon, but they can be overpriced. And a lot of times Blick Arts has it. They have them online, but they don't have like all the series. So it's like sometimes they will have Perla, sometimes they will have the Aquario, and then other times they might have Barocco, but then sometimes the Perla will disappear for a while. So it just depends. And also another company that carries them is Brush Guys. So that company actually is based in Orange County, and they have created an account for me, which is like the teacher recommended brushes. So what they do is, if you are a teacher, online teacher, they create a page for you, and they ask you for a list of your favorite brushes. You send them the list, and they say whoever, like if you refer people, you will get 5%, they will get 5% discount. So that's how it works. No pressure here, guys. It's just something that they do, and that's one of the sites that I know of that sell Escoda brushes. And of course, they do have Black Velvet series, but I usually buy them from Blick Art Store. Sometimes Jerry's, Artarama too, or Cheap Joe's, whoever has the cheaper the better deal on Black Velvet or overall any other brushes. So here, back to this painting. Enough of about the brushes. So I added more of those colors, the blues, and I used the wetter brush to spread some of that paint. Back to my short liner 10-0 Heritage Series. Again, working on that eye. I'm working on the eye because I want to add more color to it and a little bit more yellow. There's definitely some of that yellow in the body of those birds, so we can see that. And I don't want to lose it because I keep adding other colors, darker colors too. And then some of that glow I was talking about, all that yellow, I just needed to add a little more of that Isali yellow deep. So a little more of that yellow around the legs, especially that we can really see that in the reference photo. Like those feet are yellow. They need more color. So I am adding more, and I don't want to overdo it too. And at this point, like, I'm touching at the same time the background because I want to make sure the background, the bottom part, is dry before I add my shadows. So that's the thing. I need to make sure because I want the shadows to be really defined. So I'm mixing the colors. I'm adding some of that indigo, some of that cobalt blue, and there's some of those yellows a little bit. But that's the thing, I mix that color on the side and it's pretty well diluted with water, I'd say. But this is the thing, I added some of the color on the paper, wet on dry, and then I added then some of the water. So parts of that shadow are like more pale, and then it grows into the color in a way. So the bottom part, closer to the bird number 2 on the right side, it has like more color. So that's the thing. So this is the tricky part about painting shadows. Try to prepare your color mix already, like, so it's ready in your well, so it's diluted with water. So all you have to do is just grab it with your brush, because if parts of your shadow start to dry, then you can run into blooms, and you can fix those blooms by going over that area inside. But the thing is that if that's the case, you will push that paint towards the edges too much, and then the edges will have, they'll just basically have, shadows will have hard edges. You don't want to have hard edges too much. A little bit is okay, but not too much. You want to do it all at once. What I'm trying to say is have your colors pre-mixed, and then you just add slowly, but you want to do it in a steady way so no part dries before you're finished. And if you have to practice, then it's probably a good idea to do this on the side first so you get the drill of it, like how to do these shadows, because those are really important. And you don't want to add a second layer to the shadow because it's not going to be the same effect, because once you have these hard edges and then you wet that area, it's like becomes like a double hard edge. You really want to do this all in one layer. So this is the part where I'm just removing masking fluid. I kind of fast forwarded this part because it's pretty obvious what I'm doing. I'm just using the cement eraser that I got from Amazon. Actually, I got it on at Dick Blick Art Store. That's what it was. I got it at Dick Blick Art Store, and I used that cement eraser to remove masking fluid. And once I removed masking fluid, I can see some spots, white spots. There's a little bit of them. Probably if I was doing this painting again, I would preserve more white, more splatter maybe, or just more white areas. So if you are doing it, try to preserve more. So I'm still just going over those footprints and making sure that they are visible and marking some spots on the sand, just adding like a more realistic look to what we normally see in the sand, because we always see some little rocks or some spots. There's a little shadow created by sand as well. So that's the thing. I'm trying to bring more of that realistic look to my sand, and I'm focusing on my foreground. So whatever is in the foreground is definitely going to be, I will be focusing more on detail and adding colors so there's enough contrast. And the contrast is also created because by having the foreground more colorful, more detailed versus the background. So whatever the third bird is in the back, this is all like out of focus, and I'm not adding more sand, sputter or anything like that. It all stays blurry, out of focus. So just adding a little more color to those legs. And I'm not adding any new colors. This is all the same thing, the same colors going over again. So just an additional layer to make the legs more vibrant. And then going over the shadows underneath the feet, the claws basically. So a little more of that contrast, which makes it like really more realistic looking. Because it's really all about light, shadows, contrast, and just keeping it simple in a way, so not overdoing it. But that's the thing with watercolors, like it's all about really light, so you want that light and then you want that contrast, because that's what makes it look more realistic. So I am going over certain detail with an additional layer just to make it stand out more, because I really want those birds to stand out. Although, like I said earlier, the shadows are the thing for me, and the reflections on the water, and the fact that you can see that that sand is wet, and because of that blue color we can see that. So we have that layer of the warm sand colors, which is the yellow ochre, some of the quin red in there. I did mix in Van Dyke brown, but then we have cobalt blue, and I kind of created that grayish color by mixing all these colors together, and that's what I used to create the water, and then the back, the wave at the same time. Right now I'm not doing anything new, just going over the same spots, and I am using a small brush because I still want to make sure like I don't go over the areas I already painted, and I need this to be nice and detailed, those little parts. So that's it, guys. Thank you so much for taking another class with me, and I hope you enjoyed it. And please don't forget to share your work via our community section. Thank you.